You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 39, Chasing Demons. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. So, are endurance riders crazy? Well, you're about to meet someone who makes the case that they're anything but, that those lone riders streaking through the night might be chasing something more profound than gas receipts, and that these long, painful duels with time might actually be the sanest things he's ever done. We'll meet him in a moment, but first, let's tend to our usual housekeeping. And why don't we start with some thank yous? Well, as always, I really appreciate your emails and the recent podcast reviews. The latter help people find this podcast, and the former helps me feel good about doing it. I hope I haven't missed replying to any this month, because they really do mean a lot to me. Thanks also for the great response to the TML store, which I lit up in June. You'll find it on my website. I hope you like the merchandise. Please let me know what you think. And finally, thanks and welcome to a number of new listeners who found the show in the last few months. You pushed us into another league in the podcast world, and I'm humbled by that. So I hope you like what you're hearing, and I really look forward to hearing from you. And I'll wrap this introduction up with a reminder that a big reason I do this is to support the Movember Foundation, and I hope I can persuade you to do the same thing. I know this is not traditionally a big giving season, and with life hopefully beginning to return to normal again, it's probably the furthest thing from your mind. The need, however, has not gone away, and it might just be greater than ever. Anything you can give will help, and I'll know that you value this content. And with that, why don't we get started? Loyal listeners to This Motorcycle Life will have noticed by now that I'm not one of the world's most heroic sufferers. When I'm on a bike, I feel like a kid, and kids just want to have fun. They don't seek discomfort or uncertainty, and I mostly don't either. When the visor goes down, I'm more likely to have a smile on my face than a grim look of determination. If I wasn't the host of this podcast, there's not a chance I'd ever deserve to be on it. So I can't quite account for my fascination with endurance motorcycling, the kind of riding sanctioned by America's Iron Butt Association, for example. It just seems like the antithesis of fun to me, with its relatively closed community and its focus on long, uncomfortable, and risky riding. And the game, the treasure hunt as this episode's guest calls it, that seems to drive it. And yet it has this we know something you don't quality about it that just won't quite let me go. I've always wanted a peek inside this community, and there was always going to be an episode about it. And I should acknowledge that I've had a couple of accomplished Iron Butt riders contact me in the past to propose one and offer to help, which I really appreciate, and we might very well be talking to them right now if I hadn't received an email last winter from a listener named Rick Muhr. Rick is an Iron Butt rider, but he also happens to be a marathon runner and a Boston Marathon coach, so I thought he might have a unique take on the psychology of endurance. And as for the story of how he went overnight from sunny day weekend warrior to riding 12,000 miles in 2 weeks, well, as you'll see, it turns out that sometimes the pain you choose can cure the pain you didn't. I caught up with Rick Muhr in Florida, traveling on business. Hey, Rick, thanks for joining me. How are you doing?
I am well, Bruce. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I really appreciate you volunteering for this, which is kind of how it went. We're going to talk about a corner of motorcycle culture I've always found, to be frank, a little strange, but also fascinating. And you've got some unique qualifications to do that with me, which we'll get to. But before we dive in, why don't we get to know you a little bit as a rider? Now, I know you experienced a kind of turning point in your 50s, which we'll get to in a minute. But in our correspondence before that, you described yourself as what I would call a pretty normal motorcyclist. You were a lifelong enthusiast, but, kind of inclined to short, sunny day pleasure rides. How did it all start for you, and what was your path from that first Briggs & Stratton pull start bike to just before the turning point we'll talk about?
Well, I grew up in a small town in West Virginia called Buchanan, and many of my friends had Honda 50s and Honda 90s, and that was my initial introduction to bikes, and I just always dreamed about bikes. And even to this day, I'll be 63 in July next month, and I literally fall asleep most nights dreaming about bikes and what my next adventure might be. So it's been a lifelong passion and fascination. And then my mother bought me my very first mini bike, which was a rigid frame Briggs & Stratton 5 horsepower motor that really sparked my love for pursuing other aspects of two wheels.
Yeah, your path is similar to mine. I looked at those Honda 50s back in those days the way I would look at a Panigale now, and they still kind of make my heart flutter. And I started with the same lawnmower engine, so I feel like we've got some simpatico there. And yeah, it doesn't seem to let you go. Now, as this conversation unfolds, we're going to talk about your life as an endurance motorcyclist, if I can call it that. But when I picture that kind of rider, I picture a sort of a single, heavily patinaed, purpose-built motorcycle. But I think you told me you've got kind of a collection, and they're all immaculate. I think I read somewhere that you actually detailed your tricycle when you were a kid. So what's in your garage?
Yes. Well, I did detail my tricycle when I was little. My mother told me that I used to bring it up on the porch at night, and my siblings would leave theirs, kickstand up on their side in the yard, despite, rain, cold, and other challenging elements. But I would bring my tricycle up and I would ask her for a wet washcloth so I could clean it. And then I would ask her for a towel so I could cover it. And I've still remained true to that commitment of, for lack of a better reference, OCD detailing. Right now I've got a 2002 R1150R that I bought brand new with almost 100,000 miles on it. That is really my go-to bike. I've got a 2003, a 2004 R1150R. I've got a 2018 BMW R19 Classic. I've got two 2019 R9T Pures, a 2020 R9T/5. Then I have a few other bikes. I have a little Sportster Harley Davidson 48. I've got an Exile bulldozer chopper built by Russell Mitchell in Los Angeles. And then most recently, I have a Husqvarna 701 Supermoto, and that's my current collection. And I don't see that getting any bigger. I would like to see it get smaller, but it's like saying goodbye to a child. I don't think I could ever sell one.
Yeah, I know the feeling, although my collection pales before yours, and I do note the strong German theme that runs through yours. That's a pretty cool bunch of bikes. I love those R9Ts. Another conversation for another day, but I think they're wonderful.
Yes.
Now, I'm wondering kind of what motorcycling meant to you during those pre-endurance riding years. So here's the reason I'm asking. So you're a marathon runner and a marathon coach. So we'll establish that now. And that's important to know because that's sort of a Spartan life. I think if you do that, if that's one of your passions, then it tends to suggest you're kind of disciplined and focused and lots of self-denial and discomfort and determination. But the relationship you describe yourself having with bikes, or as having had with bikes, if you like, was sort of the opposite, kind of chilled out and easygoing, notwithstanding the the OCD bit, but not really a place in your life where you tested yourself, and that seems somehow deliberate, almost like a protected space. Is that right? What do motorcycles mean to a long distance runner?
That's a fascinating question that I've not been asked before and probably haven't given it too much thought, but I can tell you my initial response is, having grown up in an environment that wasn't always positive for me, it was the cornerstone of my dreaming of possibilities. The possibility of just leaving wherever I was and striking out on my own and having total control of every facet of my life. And, when we talk a little bit later on, I will tell you an ironic story, how my life came full circle from sitting on the frontage road next to Interstate 80 right outside of Joliet, Illinois, with my mini bike turned off. And I would just listen for the next motorcycle or a group of motorcyclists to come by. And as soon as I heard the motorcycle or the motorcycles, I would start my little Briggs & Stratton 5-horsepower motor, and I would take off knowing that they would eventually catch me and I would be able to ride next to them just for a few seconds. And so, when I did, one of the long runs that we'll talk about later, I will tell you how it came full circle to those days of just sitting there and dreaming. And then I never lost my love, interest, and passion for motorcycles. And I always promised myself when I was able to really afford having a motorcycle, I would definitely get one. And one day I would fulfill that dream of riding across the country, which I did. So, it's really in stark contrast in the beginning of my motorcycle days versus my life as a marathon runner and marathon running coach. But as time passed, they became very much aligned.
Yeah, I have that sense, and maybe now's a good time to get into the moment that seems to have begun. I want to ask you to take me to April 2013. And you don't have to dwell on the day itself if you don't want to. I mean, tell the story the way you think it needs to be told. I don't want to exploit your experience because obviously what I'm really interested in is the switch that flipped in your mind in the aftermath, what you called in a note to me an overnight transformation. Tell me about that.
Well, on that fateful day, Monday, April 13th, 2002, for the benefit of your listeners, that was the day of the Boston Marathon, and that was the day where the bombings occurred. And I was making my way as a running coach. I had over 300 runners in the marathon that day, and I was making my way to the finish line when the first bomb went off. And I received a text from my wife who told me that something happened at the finish line. And she thought it was a transformer that may have blown because they always have a big screen at the finish line recording all the finishers. And that made sense to me, except I noticed that there was a large group of people running toward me as I was approaching the finish line. And then it seemed like moments later, the second bomb went off and more people were running toward me. Women, in business suits carrying their heels and screaming, and I knew something was wrong. And so that was a long day for all of us, especially for the families of those who were killed that day. And I spent most of the evening in lockdown with the ATF in the hotel that I had, and had a lot of time to reflect because the next day, Boston literally looked like an apocalypse had hit. There was no one on the street. Everything was shut down. And I would say not only the entire city and state and nation, but the world was mourning what happened on April 13th. And upon further reflection, I realized once again how precious life is and how easily it could be taken from us. And so I hearken back to that dream as a little boy of one day riding my motorcycle across the country And after I spent about 2 months, consoling and caring for my runners, I really felt like I needed to start taking care of myself. So I told my wife that I was going to ride my motorcycle from the Boston area to the BMW MOA rally that year in Salem, Oregon. And so I mapped out a course, and nothing against these states, but when I looked at Illinois, which is where I was born, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, I thought that I would take a detour. And as most things in my life, I like to bring a degree of difficulty and challenge. And so upon researching different options, I came upon the Four Corners tour, sponsored by the Southern California Motorcycle Association. And so I did all the research, and then I signed up and decided that I would not only ride across the country, but I would do a number of things along the way. And one would be to complete the Four Corners. And so I started in Madawaska, Maine. And as I was on my way up there, I didn't have my passport with me because I thought that I would just be able to ride to Maine. But my GPS took me into Canada. So I approached the border, and the young woman asked me for my passport. And I said, I don't have it. I probably need to turn around because I'm doing the Four Corners and I've got to get to Madawaska, Maine. And believe it or not, she let me into Canada without my passport. And I thought I was off the hook when she let me into Canada without my passport. But I realized that was only the beginning of what turned out to be a significant challenge, and that was trying to get back into the United States without my passport. And the border guards in Madawaska couldn't believe that they let me into Canada without my passport. But once again, when I mentioned the Four Corners, they treated me like a folk hero. And so in Madawaska, Maine, there's a memorial park dedicated to the Four Corners tour, and they treat you like a rock star. People want to be the photographer of your picture in front of the Madawaska post office with your motorcycle, the Southern California Motorcycle Association towel, to begin the journey. And so, I checked in at the post office. I had my official picture taken, and then I went to a gas station to get a time and date stamped receipt and put my odometer reading on it to begin the journey to Key West, Florida. And so I rode all the way to Mechanicsburg, Virginia, and it was raining so hard I couldn't even see the white lines on the outside of the highway. So I checked into a motel until the rain stopped, which was about 3 hours. And I got on my bike and then rode all the way to Key West, arriving at about 2:00 in the morning. And the post office in Key West, it's such a unique, eccentric place, is located on the beach. And so at 2:00 in the morning, trying to figure out how I'm going to ride my R1150 through the sand to park it in a place where I could take a picture, especially after hours and hours of riding in complete exhaustion. I just didn't think that was possible. And I noticed there was actually a Jeep, the only vehicle in the parking lot. And I hit my bright lights, and there was a gentleman sitting in it. So I raced up there with my bike, and I wasn't thinking clearly because I was just so exhausted. And I put my front tire near his driver's door because I didn't want him to get out. I needed a picture, and I needed someone to help me. And he rolled down his window in utter surprise. And I said, "Would you be willing to take a picture of me?" And he looked at me like totally bewildered. And as soon as I said that, I realized how odd that must have sounded, because he said to me, "I don't know what you're up to, but I don't want any part of it." And it took me a few minutes to explain what I was doing. And he just smiled and he said, "Okay, I get it now." And he spent about 45 minutes with me getting my bike set up. And he took that picture of me in Key West, Florida. And I offered him $50 for his time because I wouldn't have been able to do that by myself. And he didn't take it, and he wished me luck. And then I went to the gas station to get my official receipt in Key West. And I had just refueled my bike, and I had my journal out, and I had my pack. I don't carry bags, and I don't have a windshield on my R1150. I just had a Aero Stitch messenger bag that I carried, just one change of clothes, a razor and toothbrush, the absolute minimum of what I would need. And I got bumped from behind, and I turned around, and there was this woman. She appeared to be in her late 80s and no taller than 5 feet tall. And she kind of nudged me pretty hard with her shoulder. And I turned around in astonishment. And she said to me, "4 corners, huh?" And I just thought it was so amazing that all these people in these 4 different towns that I went to knew about us. And so then I turned around and I rode up to Miami, and I was just so exhausted. I checked into another motel or hotel, and I only stayed there about 4 hours. And then I made my way up to Jacksonville, Florida. And so I did Key West after going to Madawaska, and then my next stop was San Diego. But I needed an oil change, so I went to Jacksonville BMW, and they asked me why I was in Florida, and I said I'm doing the 4 corners, which they knew about, and they asked me where my bags were. And I said, I don't ride with bags. And they said, "Well, how do you carry your rain gear?" And I said, "I don't wear rain gear." And I could tell that they really didn't believe me. And that seemed to be a common theme as I traveled around the country. And so I stayed overnight in Jacksonville after I got my bike serviced, and then I detailed it in the parking lot of the Courtyard by Marriott where I was staying. And another motorcyclist came out of the lobby, and we got into a conversation. I really wanted to get to bed because the next day I was going for a 50cc. It's an iron butt event, and the 50cc is coast to coast in under 50 hours. So I really felt like I needed a lot of rest, but I found this person to be so engaging that I invited him to go to dinner with me, and we talked about motorcycles. And then I got back to my room, and I got up at 4:00 because I wanted to be on the road by 5:00 to begin this journey across the United States. And I had no idea whether I could ride across the United States in 50 hours. And I really had no idea of what I would encounter. I had no expectations other than it was going to be a long shot for me to ride across the entire country from Jacksonville, Florida to San Diego in that time. And so, the first 23 hours I was going for a bun burner gold in the Iron Butt community. That is 1,500 miles in less than 24 hours. And so, along the way, I was in West Texas when I hit 1,500 miles, and it was right around 23 hours. And it was probably about, it was 3 a.m. And in West Texas, the gas stations are closed, but if you have a credit card, you can put it in the pump and it lights up like a Christmas tree and you can refuel. And so I knew that, and I did it. And when I hit receipt, it said "See cashier," and there wasn't a cashier. So, no. And I had already topped my tank off, but I went to every other pump and I just hit it enough to register. And each time it said "See cashier." So time was running out. I needed to get a receipt before 24 hours. And I rode up to the next exit that had a gas station, which was about 30 miles. And again, the clock was ticking, and I pulled into a franchise convenience store, and there was someone inside. The door was locked, but there was a woman there, and I could tell she was doing the books. And I didn't take my helmet off, which I should have, but I was knocking on the door, and it took a lot to get her to come to the door. And I explained what I was doing, and I needed a receipt. And she said, "I can give you a receipt, but it's going to take about 30 minutes. which would have taken me beyond the 24 hours. But she assured me that the time on the receipt would be the time that I got gas, so I would make it. So I literally lost, close to an hour just trying to resolve this gas receipt dilemma. Then I got back on the road and I was trying to make up for lost time. And by the way, I never broke the speed limit. I've discovered in endurance riding that the faster you go, the more tired you become. So I kept it, really locked down at between 70 and 80 miles an hour, whatever the speed limit was. And after I got the receipt, I was riding along in the middle of West Texas, and I'd never seen deer that big, and they were all over the road. So it was very unsettling. And I also had these 18-wheelers going by me at what seemed like 100 miles an hour because I was, going between 70 and 80, and they were passing me decisively. And at one point, something hit my boot, and it didn't seem heavy, but it was enough for me to feel it. And I leaned down ever so gently and felt, and there was something stuck to my boot, and it was my bank bag that contained all my receipts. And I just think about how fortunate I was to have that not fly out of my riding suit. I had put like a pull tag on my zipper so that it would be easy for me to zip it up and down. But what I discovered was the wind caught it and over time unzipped it. And it was my Aerostitch Roadcrafter, and my bag flew out. And I was just very fortunate to have it stick to my foot because my trip, for all intents and purposes, would have been over. And then, I continued on. I hit the desert at about 36 hours and it was 122 degrees and I was just falling asleep and doing everything I could to stay awake. And my primary concern was the heat of the road exploding my tires. I've never felt intense heat like that. I had a cooling vest that whenever I would refuel, and I refueled about 12 times going from Jacksonville to San Diego. And these were precision stops that I had practiced. I would come in, put my bike up on the center stand, open up my gas cap, put the key back in the ignition, and start pumping gas while doing a few yoga stretches just to stretch out my hips. And then I would go into the gas station. I would buy a Gatorade and a Nature Valley granola bar. And I would go into the men's room and use the restroom while I'm drinking a Gatorade to save time and then getting back on the road. And once I hit that extreme heat in the desert, 34 hours in, I had a cooling vest and I just soaked it and then put it under my road crafter. And by the time I was a mile down the road, it was bone dry. But by the time I got into San Diego and got my receipt, I not only broke 50 hours, despite the fiasco with the receipts. And I didn't mention that when I was in New Orleans, I got caught in traffic and I lost about an hour and a half there. So I lost about 2.5 hours. But nevertheless, when I got my receipt in San Diego, my official time was 40 hours and 35 minutes to go from Jacksonville to San Diego. So I'll take a moment here in case you want to ask me any questions, because I know that was a very long-winded response.
Well, it strikes me that this is all still very present for you, which is amazing and awesome. And so I can't help but ask, maybe I know the answer, but I was wondering why this was the response to what happened in Boston. So, if I was a runner, I might say, okay, I'm going to do the Atacama Desert Crossing or some other, challenge for which I've trained all my life. And that's not the choice you made. You surfaced this dream, from childhood, and then turned it into this epic adventure. And so I just wonder whether you wanted to reflect for a second on why it was this that seemed like the answer.
Yes, well, These are great questions, and I really have not even thought about them, but I can tell you what is at the forefront of my mind as you ask that very insightful question. I not only wanted to just chase a dream or fulfill a dream, I wanted more importantly to celebrate life. And I don't think that you really celebrate life by going the speed limit down the middle of the highway. Sometimes you have to get off in a breakdown lane, and sometimes you have to get beyond your comfort level. And I would also say sometimes you have to risk your life to feel alive. And so my way of celebrating life was just showing myself that I was capable of doing something that very few, if any, people have done before. And ever since I was a little boy, I loved chasing my limits, whether it was, growing up in this small town in West Virginia and riding out to the state park that took me all day with no food, and then getting back and consuming an entire bag of cookies from the local A&P grocery store, or getting in a rowboat and forgetting the motor and going with one oar and rowing up the river all day and then coming back. I think I've always been drawn to introspection. And so this trip was a way for me to not only to accomplish that goal, but more importantly, to feel like I was really alive and to celebrate life by challenging myself to that degree. So that would be my response to your question.
Which makes sense. You mentioned earlier that, you hadn't had the kind of smoothest start in life, and we certainly don't need to go there. But it strikes me that a lot of people who make that claim have spent their lives living with fear in some way or another, which is, kind of a destroyer of self-esteem. And I guess something like this, with all of its variabilities and all of its risks and dangers, would kind of scratch that itch. I'm wondering, I recently heard from a listener who had experienced a loss, and he told me that he, at the moment, is now riding for comfort, which is how he put it. And I originally wondered whether that was an element in your choice to do this after the Boston bombing. And now listening to you talk, clearly there was more to it. But I wonder, you just used the word introspection. I wonder whether that long, very solitary period of introspection that is endurance riding, was it? Well, in a sense, you've told me, I guess, by using the word celebrating. But I wanted to ask you, did it feel like a raging act of defiance, or did it feel like, a long meditation? And I'm kind of asking on behalf of everybody who might ever be tempted to try this, just so that we're clear about that. But I'm just curious to know how you'd characterize it.
Well, I would characterize it as, I think it was both. I think it was both. I think my life, to a large degree, has been an act of raging defiance, because I'm very, very comfortable going into my upbringing, which involved alcohol and drug addiction with my family members, not me. I remember one of my first memories in life was, an argument between my parents, which I know was fueled by alcohol. And I was only, 4 or 5 years old. And I told myself at that time, I didn't like that. I didn't want to be like that. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to turn 63 next month. And, I've never tried alcohol. And so ever since I was a little boy, I had this strong foundation of discipline and determination and dedication to my belief system. So going back to your question, for me, it was, a raging act of defiance, which, I've always been drawn to. I not only became a runner, I became a marathoner. And then that wasn't enough. So I became an ultra marathoner, where I would run over 100 miles in a day. And I was ranked 5th in the United States at 100 kilometers. That's 62 miles, as you know. And to be able to run. I've never run more than a marathon, and I wasn't expecting to enter a run of that distance, but I was working for New Balance, and I was a tech rep, and I was at a running store giving a presentation, and I realized the national championships for 100K was the following day, and they asked me if I would like to try it because I just run 2:33 in the marathon, and although I wasn't fully recovered, I was up for that challenge. And so I have this history of doing the unexpected. And so I went against the best ultra runners in the country. And, I was the outsider because I was the fast marathoner, and they wanted to teach me a lesson. And they spent about, 55 miles trying to teach me that lesson. But, we were within a little over 10K of the finish, and I was still there. And I finally moved to the front of the pack and said, are you guys ready to run now? And, that's a pretty bold move when you're running against the best runners in the country. And I ended up hanging on. At that point, there were a group of about 20, and I hung on for fifth. And so I'm very, very proud of, stepping up on my very own. I never had a coach that really believed in me. I don't think I had a teacher that ever believed in me. And so I always felt like I was going up against the odds, that I had to prove the critics and the naysayers wrong. And, this goes back to a story when I first started getting involved in BMW motorcycles, and how, all these endurance guys gave me a hard time because my bike was always perfect and it never had any miles on it. And I finally decided that, a clean bike and lots of miles didn't have to be mutually exclusive. And so I went from never riding more than 50 miles, never riding at night, certainly never riding in the rain, to deciding that I was going to qualify for the Iron Butt by riding a saddle sore, which is 1,000 miles in under 24 hours. And so that was a huge moment, a seminal moment in my life when I stepped up and tried to do that. And I ended up doing it in 17 hours. And I came home and told my wife, that's a game changer for me. I am on my way to being an endurance rider.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about coming home in a second because I read something funny about that. But first, I wanted to ask you about something else you mentioned in our email exchange, and that was about hallucinating in the desert. I think unless people have done this stuff or have read about doing this stuff, they don't really realize, how deep into a hole you can go on a ride like that. And that obviously left an impression. Do you want to talk about it?
Sure. So I have, as I mentioned, I've run over 100 miles in 24 hours, and I have hallucinated while running. But when you hallucinate on a motorcycle, it's a totally different animal because your life is literally in the balance. And the listeners are probably sitting someplace well rested, very comfortable, and it's hard to imagine unless you've ever done it. But I can only say that if you've ever been on a long trip and you wanted to make it to the next gas station or the next rest area, when you get there, you think, I can go one more. And it's a very slow process to go from complete consciousness to gradually losing consciousness and hallucinating. And so, what happened to me was I literally fell asleep on my R1150. And I had my throttle lock at 80 miles an hour, and the desert was perfectly flat and straight. And there was a team, a husband and wife team, and the husband was a motorcyclist and his wife was a passenger, and they recognized that my arms were off the side of my bike and my head was on the tank. And they realized that they were possibly going to witness something that was not going to be pleasant. And they chased me down, and I heard the air horn, but I sleep so often in rest areas just to catch cat naps that didn't faze me at all until I heard the woman scream. And that startled me. And I have them to thank for my safety and maybe my life. And so I was just injected with this infusion of adrenaline, and I was wide awake.
Wow.
But I still had 6 hours to go. And we pulled over and we talked about it, and we were both in disbelief. And honestly, they were more shaken than I was. So, that helped me to make it to San Diego. I still had 6 hours to go. And when I did arrive in San Diego, I had a reservation at a courtyard that I had in my GPS. And I don't remember checking in. What I remember is when I woke up, I still had my helmet on and I still had my riding suit on. And so I went outside and I saw my motorcycle was on the center stand, and I went to the front desk and I asked them if they could tell me when I checked in. And the woman said, "Yes, I can tell you because I checked you in 17 hours ago."
Oh my God.
And so I slept, for 17 hours with my Schubert helmet on, my arrow stitch. And when I was rested, I noticed that once I was in the desert, I started buying 2 Gatorades and 2 Nature Valley granola bars. And those were inside my riding suit. And the only thing that I can remember is I was, as a marathon running coach, I was coaching myself. Come on, Rick, you can make it. You've come this far. You're at mile 24 of the marathon. You can make it. And I think, as bizarre as it sounds, I thought I had a passenger with me. And I can only say that I'm very considerate when I hallucinate, because I was buying something for my passenger. And I know I don't share this freely because I know it could frighten people and scare people, and they might refer to me as totally out of my mind. But, when you get to the point of hallucinating, it's a very long, slow process. It'd be like putting a frog in lukewarm water and over time just gradually increasing the heat. And before you know it, it's boiling. And in my case, I was asleep. And, after this trip, and I'll finish the last leg of this trip, and then I'll tell you a few things about the effect this trip had on me for quite some time after, if that would be okay.
Yeah, sure.
So once I slept for 17 hours, I was feeling pretty rested, and I had an appointment at San Diego BMW to have another oil change. And so I took my bike in, and the mechanic came out and he told me that he had been in this business for decades and had never seen a bike with so many miles in such perfect condition, which was a great compliment. And what I discovered is most of the BMW staff there are endurance riders. So they asked me, about how I got to San Diego from Massachusetts. And I said, I did the 4 corners and I did a 50cc, and they asked me my time. And I said 40 hours and 35 minutes. And I could tell right away they didn't believe me, but they didn't want to say anything. And they also asked me about my bags and, how I could do this ride of such magnitude without the creature comforts. And, I'm not a minimalist in life, but I am when I get on my motorcycle. And so when I came back to pick my bike up, I brought all my receipts, and like a blackjack dealer in Vegas, I put them on the service counter and said, "There they are for your review." And, they couldn't believe it. And so the next day I rode from, I had to go into San Ysidro. That was the 3rd town to get my official receipt for the 50cc, but I stayed in San Diego. And then the next day I rode from San Diego up to Blaine, Washington, which was the conclusion of the 4 corners. And I had a woman up there who was Canadian who, and I think this was a Sunday, she came across the border to buy gas. And I talked her into taking my picture in front of the Blaine, Washington post office, which she did. And I rode all the way from San Diego up to Blaine, Washington in 26 hours. So This trip can be done in 30 hours, or 30 days rather. The Southern California Motorcyclists Association, I believe they give you 30 days to do it. I did it in under 8 with 2 days of rest.
Wow. I have to ask, you've mentioned a couple of times that you ride with very little in the way of equipment. And I think this experience is, inherently uncomfortable. And you also, I think, mentioned that you see a direct relationship between how difficult something is and how, much of a feeling of accomplishment you get from doing it. Obviously, philosophically, that's hard to argue with. But it all really seems like self-flagellation. It seems like taking a lot of pain. And I wonder how that's part of this and what you get from it. Tell me some more about that.
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, but I'll do my best. I'll go back to my childhood, which was steeped in pain, disappointment, fear, discomfort, so many things. And in many ways, that was the greatest blessing in my life, because it taught me not to have high expectations of others. It taught me how to deal with setback, disappointment, adversity, failure, pain, the physical, emotional, spiritual pain. I think it really prepared me to deal with almost anything that would come my way in life. And so it's been a constant companion of mine. And so as I've gotten older, my life has gotten easier in many ways. It's gotten so much better in almost every way. But that discomfort, that all of that pain, as difficult as it is for me to say, and probably even more difficult for your listeners to understand, it's like an old friend that I never wanted to say goodbye to, because that old friend helped me to be the person that I am. And so I still have these desires to push my limits beyond measure and beyond my imagination. And so, as I think about the twilight of my life, there will come a day sooner rather than later that I won't be able to ride again. And there will be a day possibly where I end up in a nursing home. And I may not even know what my name is, but I'll darn sure remember this ride. And so part of what I do might just be a collection of memories that I can draw on when I'm unable to do them.
Yeah, that part I hear a lot. To hear pain described as an old friend is kind of interesting. There's a term in psychology called reparenting, which this reminds me a bit, and your answer makes complete sense to me. Even if I'm not necessarily made of the same kind of stern stuff. I'm wondering when this ride was over. It was obviously pretty epic, especially for a first attempt at an endurance ride. I wonder when this was over if you felt like you got what you were looking for, if you felt in some way healed by what you had just done.
Yes. I definitely got what I was looking for and more, even though there was a lot I didn't realize I was looking for that I found. And I definitely felt healed. I returned. I can tell you that if I could just back up for a moment, I made it to the BMW rally in Salem, Oregon. And I'm not really a fan of large groups, but when there are that many BMW motorcycles in one spot, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. I didn't go for seminars and to see the vendors and to sit around the campfire at night. I wasn't interested in any of that, which are things that a lot of people that go to rallies go for those reasons. I went just to look at the bikes. I wanted to, see which bikes would stand out to me. So I roamed the parking lot. It's a 3-day rally. I roamed the parking lot for about 3 or 4 hours. I saw everything that I needed, and then I wanted to get back on the road. Now imagine doing that ride that I just did and feeling the draw of the road. It was calling me. And so I got back on my bike and I rode to Billings, Montana, which was 1,000 miles. And then the next day I rode to Winona, Minnesota, another 1,000 miles. And then I rode the next day from Minnesota to Grafton, just outside of Boston. So I made it back in 3 days. And as I was taking the final exit, it was very emotional for me because I remembered all the people, like my mother, who I lost in 1996 to leukemia, the day before she turned 58. And the last time I spoke with her in the Mayo Clinic, I promised her that I would do something significant with my life. And this motorcycle trip certainly wasn't part of that thought process. But when I promised her that I would do something significant with my life, it really led to my being a coach for the Boston Marathon and becoming a coach for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And over the course of 12 years, raising over $65 million with the help of a lot of people for leukemia research and being able to carry the Olympic torch in 2004. But, when I returned, when I was getting off the exit, I don't know, it was about 2 a.m. My wife and children were home in bed. I was the only one on the road. I was on the Massachusetts Turnpike. And I just had this amazing emotion come over me, just like the same feeling I had when I was completing the 4 corners as I was approaching the final exit in Blaine, Washington. Just so emotional for all the people that I loved who are no longer here, including my mother. And so when I took the final exit, Bruce, it just felt like that was another amazing journey in my life. One of the most amazing journeys in my life. And I proved to myself once again that each one of us has the ability to pursue, to chase, and achieve huge dreams if we're just willing to step from our comfort zone and all the other things, all the other barriers. When I thought about having my first child, you're never fully prepared for your first child. You're never fully prepared for most things in life. And if you don't accept the reality of that, you're never going to step from the middle of the lane, playing it safe. You may have a great life, but it's not going to be one that's filled with a lot of adventure. And that adventure could be in relationships, it could be in education, it doesn't matter the venue. And I just didn't want that. I didn't want to be middle of the road, mediocre, average. I wanted to risk things like failure. And in the end, I'm going to come up short a lot, but I'm still going to have some amazing memories that are going to be sources of inspiration to do other things. And those other things may have nothing to do with motorcycles. It might be to be the best husband I could be, which I look back on my life with my wife and think I wish I could do it over again, because she stayed home and she took care of our kids for 13 years, and I never gave her the credit that she deserved and that she earned. And that's something that I will be forever haunted by and regretful for. And so when I do these things, it's living in the spirit of continuous improvement, which is steeped in self-assessment. I'm always trying to be really brutally honest with myself about what I'm really good at, but more importantly, what I'm not so good at, and then trying to balance the scale between the two.
Yeah, I hear that, and I think that's probably a necessary condition for what you do. I mean, even for a living. But it makes me wonder about something. You got a little bit of media attention in your community after this ride, and I think you told someone that it was the hardest thing you'd ever done, and you wouldn't do it again for $1 million. And I think that stuck for about 5 minutes. And as I as I read, it was a couple of weeks before you were like looking at the Cannonball Run and an Iron Butt Rally, which is actually going on as we speak right now. Actually,
Yes.
interestingly enough. So explain that process to me. I get coming home and saying, "Well, I'm never doing that again. That was wonderful and awful." And then the pain is gone, and within a couple of weeks, you're looking at topping yourself. What's going on there?
Yes. Well, I think it's similar to standing at the finish line of a marathon and asking marathoners if they would ever do that again. And they would say, not only no, but hell no.
Right.
and then the lactic acid and the metabolic waste is removed from the muscles, and you start feeling better. And you think, it wasn't so bad after all. I don't know. I think part of it is I have a very addictive personality. And I do think, coming from a family where addiction is omnipresent, that there is a genetic predisposition for that sort of thing. And I recognized that pretty early in my life, but I decided rather than drugs and alcohol and a long list of other things, that I was going to try to do things that were a little more healthy and far less destructive. And so I was drawn to motorcycling, running. I fly fish. I do, long distance bicycling. And so those things have been my drugs of choice. And I think there's an addictive component to this when you ask the question, why after doing something so painful and miserable and uncomfortable would you think about doing it again? And, along with the pain comes a lot of other things that are very positive, the sense of accomplishment, the ability to reflect on ways that I can improve as a person and a dad and a husband and a friend. All of those things are part of it. So it's not an easy thing, but for me, that's what it's all about. Just that introspection yields a lot of desires to do other things.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. It's funny. Somebody asked Melissa Holbrook Pearson, who you and I talked about in connection with her book about endurance riding. Somebody once asked her the same question, basically, and she gave an answer which sounds a lot like something you said at the beginning of this conversation. She said, "It feels to me like literally taking control of one's life," and I wonder what you think about that.
I completely agree with Melissa's comment. When you're out there and you're searching for a gas station or a receipt in West Texas, or you're trying to avoid, what looks like a deer twice the size of my motorcycle, and you've got to get somewhere and you've got to stay awake and you have to manage all these elements and challenges, you are in complete control. You're not sitting at work having someone tell you that you need to do something. We go through life literally without a lot of control over our lives. And for a lot of people, it may not make sense that you could almost lose total control. Like you could take that trip from Jacksonville to San Diego and make an argument that I really wasn't in control of that. But the reality is, for me, I felt like I was in total control. That's why I didn't stop and sleep in Texas. It was like, I can make it, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I make it.
Yeah, there's a kind of there's something about agency, I think, that's not quite the same as control. I mean, control obviously at a certain point becomes an illusion, but there's this state you get into where you feel as if you're 100% in command of how you react to whatever is going on. And I think that may be what you're describing. I shouldn't be putting words in your mouth, but that's what it sounds like to me.
Yes. No, I think that's true.
back to suffering for a moment. One thing I've always found interesting about endurance athletes is that they take on a huge amount of pain and loneliness for a prize that's, nearly invisible to everybody else. It's not like winning a war or a Nobel Prize. It's the worst effort to reward ratio imaginable to a sane person. And that's a bit how endurance riding strikes me too. And so I'm wondering, I guess I've got two questions for you. One is, what drives the obsession with endurance? And I think we've heard you talk about what drives your obsession with endurance. But as a coach, I'm sure you've seen it all. What do people have in common who seek out this kind of experience?
Well, it's not unusual to see people who have fought addictions, whether drugs, alcohol. Those are the two primary things that I see. But there are other addictions as well, food being one of them, that turn to long distance and endurance running. And, I feel comfortable enough talking with them about their transition and transformation. And they will say to me, I'm not acting any differently than I did when I was addicted to drugs, alcohol, food. It's just that I've chosen a different activity. So I haven't really had to change my behavior. I've only had to change my activity. For me personally, a strong component was chasing the demons away, trying to keep them at bay. And those demons could be as simple as demons of doubt. When you really doubt whether you're capable of stepping up and chasing big dreams, we find ways to prove to ourselves that we're worthy and that we are capable. And, when you look at the grand stage, it could be in running, it's certainly the marathon, and in particular, the Boston Marathon. It could be any number of things. And I think people do this in everything. They do it in music, they do it in education, whether they're getting their doctorate or teaching at a specific school and being tenured at Harvard, Stanford, MIT, some of these big schools. Or it could be at an elementary school in Paducah, Kentucky, and they want to be teacher of the year. It's all relative. So I think we all possess that desire to be better and to prove to ourselves that we're capable of more than we actually think we are. I think we all have that, but not all of us really step up and test ourselves to the limit.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. And, I'm sure there are lots of people listening to this who are kind of wondering whether there's some, similar kind of white whale out there that they should be chasing. But I hear something else in what you're saying. It reminds me of somebody I met on this podcast about a year and a half ago. I interviewed a soldier who talked about her love of motorcycling in terms of it being the one place where the alertness that she had been trained to have made sense. And therefore, in a sense, it's certainly not for me to, to summarize something like this for someone else, but I'll try for the sake of the interview question. It was almost as though she had been, she had this burden and she found a way to use it that made her feel natural and at home again. And I wonder if there's a little bit of a parallel there to what you're saying. I wonder if maybe you or maybe some of the athletes you've coached have these burdens and they've decided to direct them to some positive end. And if that's maybe somehow how they're birds of a feather. Does that make sense? Is that a half coherent thought?
It does. I listened to that podcast, and when she said that, it resonated with me because I also have a military background, and it's not always easy to disseminate back into mainstream society when you're trained a specific way. So when she was describing that, it made total and perfect sense to me. I think that, we live in this world with social media, which is not real and is not true. people post pictures and they present themselves. They're like their own personal PR agents. And you seldom hear someone say on social media, I'm just so sad because I had an argument with my spouse, or, I lost my job. But when you do see those, and you do see them occasionally, the responses are overwhelming to those people who had the strength to go against society's expectations and say, you know what, my life isn't perfect. And so I'm really intrigued by that side of people. As a marathon running coach, I have seen some of the most amazing things, and I come away from those experiences feeling like there is nothing stronger or more compelling than the human spirit, especially when it's tested. And make no mistake, we will all be tested. Not only once, but multiple times throughout our lives, losing jobs, losing marriages, losing loved ones, failing at something that is so important to us. But as I get older, I'm really inspired by those people who come up short in a significant way. And they prove my theory that nothing is stronger or more compelling than the power of the human spirit, especially when it's tested. And so as I get older in life, I'm drawn to those people. I'm drawn to helping those people. I was interviewed one time by a reporter near the finish line of the Boston Marathon who was asking me about my coaching. And I don't know if you noticed this in the tagline of my email signature, but she asked me, how would you define true greatness? And I did not even take a breath. I didn't hesitate. I said, true greatness is not what we accomplish ourselves. It's the greatness that we inspire in others. And so I've had this great blessing of being a marathon running coach for mostly charity runners for the Boston Marathon the last 25 years. And so the most beautiful thing to me is seeing someone realize how capable they are.
Yeah, I hear that. And I feel the same way. It's amazing how many of those people are underneath motorcycle helmets.
Yes.
I have a question about. I want to sort of take you back out onto the road for a second. So, I've never really been close to your world. I mean, as an athlete, the closest I ever came was as a cyclist. We would do these 100-mile timed events, and
yes.
And the soundtrack in my head the whole time was, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this. I just wasn't kind of cut out for it. We did some teammates and I did a cross country ride. It was a sort of a 24-hour relay many years ago, and that involved some long nights on the Trans-Canada Highway. And what was going on in my head then was a bit like cleaning out a drawer, or an attic. You just didn't know what you were going to. Anyway, so enough about me. But this all leads up to the question: what's going on in your head out there? I doubt you're saying, "I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this." But at hour 24, what's playing inside that helmet?
Yes. Well, I would like to preface my comments before I make an observation and answer your question by saying that I'm a very astute observer of human behavior. And what I've learned is that we are inherently lazy as individuals. I don't care whether you're an endurance motorcyclist, an ultra marathoner, or what venue you want to refer to. We are inherently lazy. And what I mean by that is, given the choice, we're more likely to take the path of least resistance. And we're also drawn to comfort and convenience. And so that fuels a lot of these negative thoughts that we have, like, I can't wait until this is over. And I said to one of my runners just the other day, I said, and she's a freshman in high school, and I just started coaching her. And I said, you know what? Megan, the best part of running is stopping. And that is so true, because when I'm coaching marathoners and I ask them, what are you thinking about at mile 16? 99.9% of them say to me, I'm thinking that I've got 10 miles to go until this is over. And that's human nature, and that's the way most people are. But to answer your question, I'm not like that. When I'm feeling like I don't want to take another step and I've got 50 miles to go, I'm celebrating that discomfort, because there are hundreds of thousands of people, many of them small children, who have never even learned to walk yet, in hospitals around the world, fighting for one more day of life. And I'm not going to be out here as an able-bodied person who is very fit, complaining about the gift that I have. And that's the lesson that I try to teach people. Yes, life is going to be filled with challenges, setbacks, disappointment, failure, discomfort, inconvenience. The list is long, but we should be grateful because we are here. We have an opportunity to be better every day. And so that's what I think about. I do think about getting to the end. And I do think that, when I finish this, the shower's going to feel great. A meal's going to be wonderful. And I've heard atheists talk to God in some of the events that I do. Dear God, get me to the finish line and I will be a believer. That's just human nature. When we're hurting, we're uncomfortable, we're drawn to comfort. And I suppose, Bruce, I have just trained myself and learned to embrace the discomfort, because with every storm, it's followed by sunshine. And sunshine to me is getting through an event that most people couldn't, getting through an event where I had my own doubts about my own ability, and then being rewarded with this feeling like, if I can do that, I can handle anything else. So for me, it's just this state of confidence that I can keep everything at bay that I've dealt with. So for me, it's really kind of a selfish thing, because yes, I'm putting my body through some challenges, but I know that the rewards are going to be so significant.
That sounds like a thought process you had to train yourself to have, because by your own admission, it kind of defies human nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, this is something, when you have people that don't believe in you, that's powerful motivation. When someone says, "Oh, you can't do that." I remember when I ran my first marathon, I was stationed at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, and this was a Friday in 1978. I had just turned 20 years old, and I was out for my longest run, 7 miles. Never gone that far before, and I came upon 3 runners, and they, after some small talk, they asked me if I was running the marathon on Sunday, and I said, "How far is the marathon?" And their response was, "Well, you're clearly not running it." And I said, "Well, it depends. How far is it?" He said, "It's 26.2 miles, and you can't do that." And I immediately said to myself, I am doing it. And so I got up early on Sunday morning at 4:00. I couldn't sleep. I went to the chow hall, and I had a stack of pancakes that nobody should eat before a marathon. And these runners, I found out later, because I didn't know what the Boston Marathon was until later that day. But these runners, I found out, had run Boston, had qualified. And so in the marathon, just 2 days later, I caught the first one at mile 10. I caught the next one at approximately mile 19. And I caught the third one at mile 26 with 385 yards to go. And I pulled away from him. And at that time, you had to run under 3 hours to qualify for the Boston Marathon. And again, I didn't know what the Boston Marathon was until the announcer said, and the last runner to qualify for the Boston Marathon is Rick Muhr, 2 hours, 59 minutes, and 55 seconds. So
Wow.
I made it by 5 seconds.
Listening to you
And
talk.
then,
Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, and please keep your thought, I was just going to make a final comment. In 1979, in April, 6 months later, I went to Boston with those 3 runners, and we ran together.
That's a great story, and I am aware of what an accomplishment it is to qualify for that event. It's one of the few that you actually have to earn your way into. So I can imagine that felt great. Listening to you talk about this, though, you said if you tell me something that I can't do, that I'm going to go do it. I feel like that part might be innate. I'm married to someone like that, and I've interviewed 1 or 2 for this show, and I lack that muscle myself. If you tell me I can't do it, then I'll probably analyze it and decide whether that's true or not, and whether I care enough to prove you wrong, and then at some point I'll come to a conclusion and I'll do it or I won't do it. That feels like it feels like there are some of you out there that just sprang forth with that big old chip on your shoulder, and I love having you all in my life. In our email correspondence, we talked a bit about Melissa Pearson's book, The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing. And that's a book about the late John Ryan, who was kind of a legendary endurance rider. And she was fascinated by this guy, who she found, in the words of one reviewer, she found him to be enigmatic and magnetic. And that certainly comes through in the book. But to be very honest with you, he didn't strike me as someone I would enjoy having a beer with. He seemed very distant and sort of self-serious and very much a closed book. And so I'm curious to know what your take was, and then perhaps more relevant to our conversation, do you think that's the breed? Is that the kind of person I'd be likely to meet if I went to the IBR this week?
Wow, that's a great question. I've been around that community for a long time, and I think John's disposition is very typical of that community. I've been to the start of the Iron Butt, and I love just the day before, where people were in the parking lot of the hotel and setting up their bikes and talking about their plan. And I love that. I love the preparation. And I find a lot of these, and I'm trying not to be stereotypical, but, my son is a 3rd-year mechanical engineer student at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And, I was an engineering, science, and math specialist for Pearson Education, selling these textbooks to college professors. And I think that group of people, whether they're college professors teaching engineering, are similar to the long distance riders, the endurance riders. They're very analytical. They have all the technology. I'm not that type of person. I mean, I'm a driven person. I don't look at the odds and try to put them in my favor like these riders do. And so when I read Melissa's book about John, I feel the same way about him that you do. I'm not sure he is the type of person I would want to sit down and spend some time with and have an engaging, fascinating conversation. Somewhat introverted, introspective, a lone wolf, someone who preferred to be by themselves than with a large group of people. I find that to be fairly typical of a lot of people. But again, I don't want to be stereotypical, because there are anomalies. You go there and there's like this, I don't know, just a dynamic person who is the life of the party, and, they're lighthearted, and they go out and, they've got a teddy bear strapped to the back of their R1250 GS, and they're just going to have a great time. But I think those people are in the minority.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, you're right about stereotypes. But I in an effort to kind of understand the scene, I felt like the question was probably fair.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. And before we go on, I wanted to make one comment. You were talking about this. You didn't describe it as an attribute, but this characteristic of someone telling you that you couldn't do something and you're going to prove them wrong. I just wanted to make a comment about that. I find that to be both a blessing and a curse. More a blessing than a curse, though.
I bet that's true. So back to John Ryan for a second. He was killed on his bike, I think the same year as the Boston bombing, coincidentally.
I think it was.
Yeah, and although nobody's sure exactly what happened, or at least I'm not aware of an official story, there was inevitably a lot of conversation online about the risks of this kind of riding. And I'm wondering, in your recollection, how that played out in the IBA community. I mean, Melissa Pearson has argued that endurance riders are the safest riders on the road because they don't speed. So there's obviously a spectrum there, but I'm wondering how that played out in the IBA community after Ryan was killed, and then more generally, how that subject is viewed there.
Yes. The difference between like just someone who is going to go out and try to ride an iron butt saddle sore 1,000 miles in under 24 hours in the IBR riders is, they're going to do 12 consecutive days of these 1,000-mile days. And I can appreciate what they're doing. I did 12,000 miles in 2 weeks. And I did that solely on my own with no expectation. And that's why I've always been tempted to test myself in an iron butt. But I confessed recently that I'm not one of those analytical types. And the thing that has dissuaded me or discouraged me from doing the IBR is kind of the treasure hunt aspect to it. That you've got to, if you go this way, you're going to earn so many points. And if you don't make it back to the checkpoint within the time limit, you're going to penalize that many points. That wouldn't be my strength. My strength would be, okay, let's start at 6 o'clock and we'll see who can stay on their bike the longest. And that's my addiction. So I think that the difference is these people that do these 1,000-mile days for 12,000 miles, they've got to be very comfortable spending time alone and managing a lot of unexpected circumstances. I don't know if I really answered your question the way that you were expecting me to, but that's my perspective.
Right. Well, so the question was, I suppose maybe the way to go straight at it has to do with this sort of risk calculus, if you like. There's no doubt, and you kind of proved this with your story about hallucinating in the desert. There's no doubt that if things don't go just so, this can suddenly become quite dangerous. And when we take things like that on, there's almost like a level of selfishness about it. And actually, it's funny, as I think about it, my wife ran a marathon a few years ago, ran New York, which is just a great experience. And her biggest issue training for it was that she felt like she was being selfish. So I don't think it's just risk-based. But I kind of wondered how the community processes that and explains it to itself, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, it does make sense. And, Bruce, I think it's really based on the individual, because I think whether you're a rider who rides just like I did for so many years, only in the daylight, never in the rain, no more than 25 or 50 miles at a time, or you're an endurance rider, I think we all accept the reality and risk of being a motorcyclist, especially these days with people not paying attention to driving nearly as much as they pay attention to their phones. But in the community itself, especially the endurance community, I think it's just part of living that lifestyle. Whether, Fran from a few years ago was killed during the IBR, Fran Crane, she was killed, even though she had an accident. I think she was administered the wrong medication, which killed her in the hospital. So within the community itself, I think just like in life, you expect a certain percentage people to die. But when it happens, I think it's just a temporary wake-up call because it goes away quickly. Myself, I've never been discouraged by it. In fact, I think the complete opposite for me. I'm hypersensitive about having an escape route in every situation and not putting myself at risk unnecessarily. And I probably seem somewhat like a hypocrite after describing what happened to me in the desert. But in general, if I would have known that I was going to encounter what I encountered in the desert, I would have stopped in Texas and slept, because the reality is I lost more time trying to stay awake than if I had just slept for 3 or 4 hours and gotten up and gotten back on the road. So to answer your question, I don't think it has a significant impact on the community when we lose one, not to discount the pain that friends, family go through when someone passes. But that's my perspective.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's an interesting insight into that world, I think. You mentioned something a minute ago which caught my attention, and it has to do with what I'll call strategy. So, we've talked a bit about endurance. We've talked a little bit about risk, and I think maybe the third, kind of leg on this stool has to do with the game, which I think you called it a treasure hunt. And I get that you weren't particularly attracted by that, but it's clearly a big piece of this for a lot of people. The kind of extreme exercise of control, if you like, over the planning process. And I'm curious what your observations have been, since you're not, thus afflicted. I'm curious to know what your observations have been about what that gives people, the people who do this, how much it's part of this taking control of your life thing we talked about earlier.
Well, I think it's probably a very big part. I mentioned that, I've been to these events and I've stood in the parking lot. I also mentioned that I'm a very astute observer of human behavior. And, there is an element of egotism here, to say I'm going to do this on a particular bike, whether it's a moped, which has been ridden in an iron butt rally before, or a Harley Davidson, something atypical of like a Yamaha FJR or a BMW, you name the model. So there's posturing that goes on, as you're setting your bike up. Do you have the latest computer? What auxiliary lighting do you have? What bells and whistles? I mean, these bikes look like spaceships. And I look at them and I don't want any part of that. I would love to do one on my 2002 R1150R that I've ridden every one of the almost 100,000 miles on, and do it with an Aero Stitch backpack and do it my way. But I don't know if I would ever be afforded that. I mean, I have entertained the thought of not going for all these bonuses and just riding checkpoint to checkpoint and doing it so efficiently that I would get a great night of sleep every night. But again, I would be the anomaly. I think a big part of it is I've got the latest, I've got the greatest, and I'm going to show you that I have the determination or the resources to beat you. And I like that to a degree, but it's not who I am. I understand it and I appreciate it, but I'm a competitive person and I would like to beat everyone in any event that I did, but I'm not going to posture about it and I'm not going to put a lot of money into it. I want to do it not with technology. I want to do it with determination.
Yeah, which I think makes sense for a runner, which is not to, to diminish the value of the experiences you just, as you prefer to have it, but it does sort of square for me with who you are in your life more broadly. So that's
yes.
a sensible answer. I wonder what you think of this. So I kind of loathe the choosing of sides and false binaries and all that kind of stuff. But I think in this case, it might reveal something interesting about endurance riding. So when I was researching for this conversation, I kind of formed a thesis in my mind that endurance riding is exactly the opposite of adventure riding. And what I mean by that is that, the adventure rider says, okay, let's go down this road and see what happens. And I've got a tent in case things go wrong. And so they kind of embrace chaos. Whereas it strikes me that the typical iron butt rider actually strives to minimize variables. That might even be a phrase you used earlier in this conversation, but I have it in my notes anyway. What do you think about that? Is that a fair contrast? Am I being mean to either party there, or do you think there's some sense in it?
No. I not only think it's fair. I think it's absolutely accurate. I think that's a very astute observation. They're in my mind polar opposites, even though they may be riding the same bikes. They've got a different mentality around it. The adventure rider is doing that, just that. They're going for an adventure. And that could be on a road that hasn't been ridden in years and challenging beyond any interstate that most IBR runners are going to encounter. Riders, I'm the same way. I'm the endurance part of it. I'm not the adventure rider at all. I mean, I don't like getting my bikes dirty. I don't like getting them scratched. And so if I had a GS, and I've had a GS before, it was probably the cleanest GS in the world. And, my GS friends would look at it and say, that's just blasphemous. That bike should be dirty. And so many of those adventure riders say that, I don't wash my bike, I ride it. Well, I had a lot of BMW riders tell me that. That you're doing an injustice to that bike. It's so clean and it doesn't have any miles. And part of my driving force into transforming myself into an endurance rider was to show people and silence the critics who were saying, your bike can't be clean and have a lot of miles on it. And if you saw my R1150R with almost 100,000 miles on it, you would say, oh my gosh, that bike is never been ridden. And, when I did my 12,000 miles in 2 weeks and I came across South Dakota on red clay roads and I checked into my hotel in Winona, Minnesota, you couldn't even tell the color of my bike. But the next morning, it looked like it was on the showroom floor because before I could fall asleep, I knew I would sleep better if it was cleaned.
It's like we're related. That's funny. So I've had a few IBA riders, Iron Butt Association riders, reach out to propose episodes for this podcast. And the thing that fascinated me about you was that you had this experience with marathons and the sort of culture of endurance sports. So that's why we're talking. But,
yes.
But I appreciated all of them being interested. But it left me with the feeling that this is a group that wants to be understood. And I wonder if you think that's true, and if you do, what that's all about.
I do think it's a group that wants to be understood. I think most groups are that way anyway, but I think in particular this group wants to be understood because, it's almost like a balancing act, Bruce, between I want to be so different and unique, and on the opposite end of the teeter-totter is I want people to understand why I do this. And they seem mutually exclusive, and it's somewhat contradictory because we want to do things that most people don't do, but we want people to understand why we do them. And I agree. That's a question that I may not be capable of answering because I've asked myself that. I love riding by myself. I don't like to ride with anybody, anytime, anywhere. If you want to ride with me, I'll meet you for lunch somewhere, but I'm not riding there with you. And when I get there, I want to hear about your ride, what you liked about it, what was challenging, but I don't want to share it with you because it's not because I'm antisocial. It's because anytime I'm around another bike, I'm distracted. I don't hear my bike. I don't feel my bike as well as I do when I'm by myself. So that's a great question, but I'm not sure that I know the answer to, because I find myself in that category. I love distancing myself, no pun intended, from most people.
Right.
But I also want people to understand, and that's why I was so interested in taking my motorcycle to various motorcycle shops, whether it was Twisted Throttle or Wagner BMW in Worcester, Massachusetts, or a list of other places, and having my bike in the showroom right next to me when I gave my presentation with a map of the United States, and I told this story that I shared with you. I wanted people to understand it. And most importantly, I wanted people to be inspired by it, not necessarily to get on a motorcycle and try something, but maybe to go home and be the best Little League coach they could be for their son or daughter.
Yeah, I think that is the lesson that anyone can take from this, and maybe especially motorcyclists. So I'm just going to refer back to Melissa Pearson one more time. In the interview
Yes.
I mentioned earlier, she talked about how the subject of endurance riding tends to kind of divide a room in two. There are those who don't get it and therefore probably aren't cut out for it, in her words. And there are those who, as she put it, get this little glint in the back of their eye. What do you think makes the difference?
Well, first of all, I want to say you cannot refer to Melissa too much. I love her and follow her on Facebook, and I've read, the books that she has written, and, I don't have her intellect, but I've appreciated her insight. Yeah, I think she's right about that. There are those that couldn't care less, and those that, have the little glint in their eye or smirk on their face, or the desire to pursue that conversation. I'm drawn to that group. I love to have conversations with other people who have chased big dreams on their bikes, try to understand what motivates them and inspires them, and what is it that compels a person to do some of these things. But I wouldn't do that at the neglect of those who have no appreciation, because I'm equally drawn to them to find out why they can't relate, or why they think it's just crazy to do anything of that magnitude on a motorcycle. And it's always an interesting juxtaposition between those two categories that you described. But I revel in that. I would love to spend an evening in a room full of people that was equally divided and speak to every person in the room, because I know I would emerge enlightened and inspired and motivated. So that's, I love the questions that you asked. I've never been asked them before, and it requires me to think so quickly and deeply on such short notice. But I think those initial results sometimes or those initial thoughts sometimes are the most pure thoughts that I ever have.
Yeah, I share your view about being curious about people. I mean, I don't think there's anyone I've had on this show who probably wasn't a better rider than I am, and who probably hasn't done something that I would consider impossibly daring. So I don't need an echo chamber, and it sounds like you don't either.
No.
So let's just get prescriptive for a second. Maybe some of the people who are listening to this are getting that little glint in the back of their eye. What advice do you have for them? If someone's sitting out there, in their car listening to this podcast, and they're kind of thinking, that sounds like me. What advice would you have for them?
Well, first of all, I would hope that I could give you my email address, so that if anyone is interested in connecting with me, I can give that to you before this podcast is over. You could put it in the show notes, because I love to interact with people. And I'll use an analogy, because I am a marathon coach. And so many people come to me and say, I've always dreamed of running the Boston Marathon, or I've always wanted to run a Boston Marathon, but I never thought I could do it. I think that same disposition applies to motorcycles. I'd love to do it. It seems so romantic and adventurous, and I just don't know where to begin. And whether I'm speaking to someone who has a dream of running a marathon or someone who has a dream of starting to ride a bike, I would pretty much say the same thing. Just take your time, really think it through, and then properly prepare. In the case of someone who wants to get into motorcycling, obviously taking a motorcycle safety foundation course is a good start, because you can learn on someone else's bike. You don't have to invest a lot of money and discover that maybe it's not for you. But I also think that is the first brick in the foundation of being a safe, reasonable, lifelong rider. And when I'm training someone for the marathon, I start them very, very conservatively. And I say there are two key components to anything you start, whether it's fly fishing, playing the piano, riding a motorcycle, or running a marathon: consistency and moderation. And I would add a third leg to that stool, and that is living in the moment. Don't get too far ahead of yourselves. Sometimes people want to go from not running at all to running a marathon. They want to go from not ever riding a motorcycle to riding a R1250 GS. Just be consistent, be moderate, be reasonable, and take your time and live in the moment. Don't get too far ahead of yourself.
And you would give that same advice to somebody who was contemplating, their first bun burner, for example?
Yes. I'm somewhat of a hypocrite, because I will tell people to be consistent and moderate, and moderation has seldom, if ever, been a part of my life. I went from 7 miles to the marathon. I went from the marathon to 100K, 62 miles. I went from 62 miles to over 100. In my motorcycle life, I went from, that ride only during the daylight, never in the rain, no more than 50 miles, to a saddle sore, 1,000. So I offer advice, not from my own experience and what I've done, but just from what I've learned from that experience, that it's much better to be moderate and consistent than it is to to bite off these huge chunks of miles, or the size of a motorcycle, for instance. I try to look at things from the long view. I know with social media today, people want to run a marathon just to say they did it, and they have the medal, and that medal sits in a top drawer, and they tell stories for the rest of their lives about it, which I don't disagree with. But what I do is I'm in for the long haul. I've been a runner for 45 years. I've been a motorcyclist for almost 55 years. So I just don't like to see people that get into activities just for the sake of saying they tried it, did it. I like to see people that are really in it for the long haul or the long run. I think that's where the real benefits are.
Yeah, that sounds sensible. But it's funny, my next question was going to be, what would you say to people who, I'll call them sort of bucket listers. So the marathon world, I'm sure, is full of people like this who didn't want
full of it.
Yeah, right. And so somebody out there, maybe even me, is going, well, geez, it'd be cool to just do like one, to just say that I did it. And it sounds like what's in your heart is that you don't think people should be dilettantes. But is there room for the person who wants to taste it?
Bruce, if I'm being completely honest, and that's the only way I like to be, I'm talking to possibly a group of your listeners, and I'm one of them, and I feel honored, by the way, to be asked to share my story and speak with you. So I don't want to go without telling you how much I respect you. And that's the reason I reached out to you in the first place, because I listen to so many podcasts, but this is my favorite one. And I don't say that to patronize you. I say that to tell you from the bottom of my heart, that's how I feel. I love the way you ask questions. I love the research that you do. I love your ability to make everyone feel welcome. And so I want to thank you for that. And I also want to say that, to be brutally honest, I just mentioned, from a very safe standpoint, this is what I recommend. Start conservatively, be consistent, be moderate, take your time. But my heart is yelling at me to say, tell them what you really think. And what I really think is, I am so inspired by those people who are like I am, who defy all the odds, and they go against everything that you would think you would need to do in order to step up and do a saddle sore. Those are the people that I'm cheering loudest for. So if you're one of those people, I'm going to beat the bongo drums and tell you should do it.
That is an honest answer, and I appreciate it, and thank you also for the kind words, which I'm kind of sitting here, blushing about. But I have to say, I kind of agree with you. I mean, I think that there's a sensible, piece of advice that says, plan, work up to it, train, get used to it, minimize all the risk. But like you, I have this feeling that sometimes the wine is all that much better if you just, maybe that's a bad analogy, but
I know where you're going.
There's something to be said for just holding your nose and diving in.
That's right. That's right. And that's the way that I've lived, and I'm inspired by those people, and I encourage those people to do it. I would much rather see someone step up in a big way and fail completely than just sit on the couch and never try anything. So I'm all for that type of person.
Have you ever been able to go back to short sunny day rides? Has motorcycling and its place in your life changed forever?
No, not at all. In fact, I live in Grafton, Massachusetts, and I've been there for about 25 years. And, I'm a runner, a biker, and a motorcyclist, and I've explored every road in our little town and all the surrounding communities. And, I work for a nonprofit in Worcester, and so I work pretty long hours. And, sometimes I only have a couple hours at the end of the day of daylight. And I'll hop on one of the bikes that I mentioned, and I'll just go out for, 30 miles, and I'll have so much fun. I will sometimes exceed the speed limit slightly, if it's 35 and I'm going 50 and there's no one on the road, and I know the road like the back of my hand, and I'll just speed up a little bit, and I love to dive into the turns, and I find it very, very therapeutic. So it's similar to going for a run, but it might be a 30-mile motorcycle ride, and I just come back feeling like there's nothing better. There's nothing that could make me feel like this. I mean, running comes close, but given the choice, I'd rather be on my motorcycle than going for a run.
Wow.
And then, the thing that I do at the end of my ride, every time I ride my motorcycle, I spend about 15 minutes cleaning it. And I've got a system that from the bottom to the top, the way I go through my bike with the Q-tips, the baby diapers, and, the Mr. Clean diluted 50/50, I've got a system that is so wonderful. And, all my bikes are absolutely perfect because of that. And it's a small investment of our time. And I was reading a bicycle magazine and just today, and someone asked a longtime mechanic what was the greatest lesson he ever learned about bicycle maintenance. And he said, clearly, the number one lesson I learned is that a clean bike is a functional bike and a mechanically sound bike. Because when you clean your bike, I've discovered things like, nails in my tire, or a loose bolt, or a loose chain that I never would have really discovered had I not cleaned my bike. And so I do have OCD around detailing my bikes, but I've got a system. And I've written a few articles in the BMW RA magazine, OTL, about detailing bikes. It's very, very simple. It doesn't take a lot of time, and it's a great investment of your time.
Yeah, and it's kind of a meditation too, I imagine. Um, I'm I'm curious to know just about one more thing, which will be the most predictable question in the world. But it's kind of what's next for you. I mean, you describe this as being almost an addiction, and by this I mean endurance riding. Do you have some rides planned, especially as the world opens up?
I do. I was hoping to go into the Canadian Rockies this summer and then make my way over to Vancouver, British Columbia, and then go down the Oregon coast. I've ridden in uh, every state in the lower 48. I've not ridden in Alaska or Hawaii, and honestly, I don't have any real burning desire to do that. I wanted to come down the Pacific Coast Highway, and then I've never ridden in eastern Oklahoma. I wanted to go down into the Ozarks and then over and do the Notches Trace, which I've done before from Mississippi up to Nashville, and then get on the Blue Ridge Parkway and come back. But this year I'm not sure because I'm so steeped in my work at the charity that I work for in Worcester, Massachusetts, that I don't know that I'm going to find the time. And what I said earlier about focusing on being a better husband and father. I just feel closer to my family when I'm close to home, and I've taken so many trips that I feel like this year is a great year for me to reconnect with my family and my community. But I do want to ride from the border of Canada to the border of Mexico. I think it's Norvallis, maybe Montana to Nogales, Arizona. I've got to research it more, but I want to do that trip. And I wouldn't mind going for a record from New York to LA. So I still, even though I'm going to be 63, I still feel like I need to try one other significant ride before I say, okay, I'm just going to back off now and enjoy some local rides. And then I've got a son who turns 21 next month, and his name is Ryder, Rider. And I've thought about, when my life is over, what bikes, he would like. And I spoke with him recently, and I said, hopefully I'm going to live, another 20 years or so, Ryder. And I don't know that internal combustion engines are even going to be a thing for you. So maybe I should sell all of these and keep one or two and just prepare for my retirement. So I don't know what's next for me. I still have some rides that I really want to do, but I just really do want to continue to have motorcycling be such a main part of my life. And also at the same time, balance everything in my life, which is, being a dad, being a husband, and being a good friend to people, and trying to be the best person that I can be, and hopefully a source of inspiration to some.
That sounds like a noble life plan, but I would say that I wouldn't give up on riding too soon. You may have a long road ahead of you, especially given how fit you are. My dad rode till he was nearly 80. You might not be want to be in too much of a hurry to sell those bikes.
I know. I think about it, but I'm not planning on backing off my motorcycling anytime soon. It's just been too important. I know early in the call before we end, I wanted to tell you how I felt like this dream of sitting on the side of Interstate 80 on my mini bike and riding across the country came full circle. If I could just have a moment to do that.
Yeah, of course.
So I mentioned that I sat as a young boy on the side of that Interstate I-80 and dreamed of riding cross country. Well, when I was coming back from Winona, Minnesota, back to Boston to conclude my Four Corners journey and also the 12,000 miles in 2 weeks, I thought, I should just go by where I sat on the mini bike, where this all began. I should just drive by there. And my mother lived in a trailer park in a little town called Manuka, Illinois. And I remember I had cut off the sleeves of my Cub Scout shirt And I had this chain around my neck and, probably 11 years old. And these outlaw bikers from Chicago kept coming by all the time. And I aspired to grow up and be an outlaw biker. And thankfully I didn't. But I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I just rode by that little spot? And so I was coming through Madison, Wisconsin, which I lived in Madison for a few years after I left. So I'm coming out of Winona, Minnesota, and I stopped in Madison, Wisconsin to refuel. So I reset my tripometer, and I had to go a little bit out of my way to get to Manuka. It was off the beaten path a little bit. But, Bruce, as soon as I got to the exact point where I looked over, where I would sit and dream about one day doing this very trip, I looked at my tripometer and it had 180, like I-80. And it just felt to me like my mother was speaking to me, like, son, I am so proud that you finished this journey because you used to tell me about it. I just thought it was very ironic that it was 180 on my tripometer. And that's how I felt like that dream came full circle. So I just wanted, I know I mentioned it earlier in our talk, so I just wanted to conclude with that.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. It's a great coda, and proof again that there's still magic in the world.
Yes.
Rick, this has been, I guess it's been kind of an endurance interview, for which I apologize, and I thank you for bearing with me. But I know that I have to let you go because I made that promise. So thank you for speaking with me, and thanks for giving us a peek into this world and honestly into your life. I always feel really privileged when people feel that they can be, that emotionally honest on this podcast, and you've done that. So that kind of makes my day. And your insights have been, really illuminating. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my story a little bit. And I just want to say to you and all the listeners that I, not for a moment, think that I'm special for having done some of the things that I've done. As I've said to you, I'm just a very determined person. And I say that because I want anyone out there who is listening to chase their dreams and not be afraid of coming up short. And if there's ever anything that I can do to help encourage them, I hope that they will reach out to me, with my email, which I know you have, and I hope you will put in the show notes so people can get in touch with me. But I'm just like most people. And I think we all have the same capacity to accomplish things. So I would just encourage people to do that because, as I said at one point in this interview, I didn't need to be reminded again of how precious life is and how quickly it can be taken from us.
I can't think of a better sentiment to end on. So I'll just say thanks again and ride safe out there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bruce. You too.
It's a pleasure. Bye now.
Goodbye.
Well, I didn't really expect this conversation to get as personal as it did. I thought it would be an interesting peek inside a fascinating fringe of motorcycle culture. And on reflection, maybe it was. Let me explain what I mean. I think a lot of us sometimes personify our motorcycles. We think of our bikes as friends or lovers or partners or even weapons, but almost never as protective mentors. And yet, for most of us sometimes, and for some of us most of the time, well, that's exactly what they are. Like a mentor, a motorcycle expects things from you. You have to invest, and there are rules, and there are consequences for failing. But it's also constant. You can trust it, and if you do what's expected, well, it can show you the kind of peace and happiness that only a kid can really understand. What better companion could there be for a healing journey? What better vehicle to transition from darkness to dawn? Well, if we want to connect somehow with this strange corner of motorcycle culture, well, then maybe that's the way to do it. To imagine what motivates this madness, and that many of the people who choose this cycle of risk and pain and triumph do it because it's a way of dealing with life's unfinished business. I'm sure there are many, many endurance riders who do what they do simply for the challenge. Maybe that's even most of them, and they have my respect. But the ones who do it to take control of their lives, as Melissa Holbrook Pearson put it, well, them I get. That, too, is something a motorcycle can do, and maybe even the thing it does the best. Thanks for listening. Bear with me as we take a short break in July while I catch up on some hugs. I'll be back in August with a fresh episode that promises to break some new ground for this podcast, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, you'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com, including the promised contact information for Rick Muhr. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. That latter file is bulging with good ideas now, so thank you. Thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and I'd love to hear from you. You can also find me on Instagram, where I'm at thismotolife, and where you'll find many of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, including Rick Muhr. This episode's playlist recommendation comes from Heartland, Vermont, and an introspective singer-songwriter named Jay Nash. Discovering Jay's music was one of those happy accidents that this podcast generates sometimes, and his own story has echoes of this episode's theme of leaving home in order to find it again. Well, this track seemed perfect somehow. It's about unfinished business and the pull of the road. And it's called Places You'll Go. Buy it or stream it wherever you like to get your music. And in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.
I hear a train whistle blowing. Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. And I feel my life is gonna change soon. Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. Sorry and outspoken, wondering where to go. Recollect our dreams while we sort through our clothes. Today's the day we're leaving, there's so much left undone. Unsaid goodbyes and severed ties, songs unsung. But oh, the places you'll go. I hear a train whistle blowing. Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. And I feel my life is gonna change soon.